John Miller's shoes clicked against the marble floor of the lobby as he pushed through the revolving doors of Harrison and Cole Financial. It was 8:56 a.m. The number echoed in his head like a mantra. 4 minutes early. Safe. Acceptable. The building's lobby gleamed sterile and cold, polished steel and glass reflecting faces that all wore the same mask, tired, tense, obedient. The kind of faces you saw in every corporate high-rise, but in this one, they looked sharper, more strained, because here, lateness was a crime. John swiped his badge at the security gate and stepped into the elevator. Around him, colleagues avoided eye contact, murmuring under their breath. He's checking watches again today. New quarter. He's always worse in a new quarter. The elevator dinged at the 14th floor, and John stepped out into the open-plan office, where rows of desks stretched under fluorescent light. Phones rang, keyboards rattled, coffee cups trembled on desks. But beneath the surface, hum was an undertone of fear. At the far end, framed in a glass-walled office, stood Richard Harrison, their manager, their warden. Harrison was the kind of man who filled every room he entered, even when he didn't speak. His charcoal gray suit strained against broad shoulders, his steel gray hair was cropped short, and his jaw was permanently clenched like he was grinding down his molars one by one. Today, Harrison didn't stay behind the glass. Today, he strode into the bullpen like a general on inspection. "Everyone," he barked, his voice carrying without effort. "Conference room, now." Chairs squeaked back. Employees exchanged wary glances. John caught sight of Emily Torres, her dark hair tied back neatly, her expression already half amused, half exasperated. She muttered as they filed toward the room. "Another sermon. God bless corporate America." John didn't smile. He'd worked under Harrison long enough to know that humor wasn't safe, even whispered. The conference room filled. Harrison stood at the head of the long oak table, a massive digital clock projected on the wall behind him. Its glowing red numbers ticked in silence, merciless. "Do you see that?" Harrison stabbed a finger at the projection. "That is time. Time is the currency of this company. And what have I seen lately? Sloppiness, excuses, slackers who think 1 minute late doesn't matter." He scanned the room with predator's eyes. 1 minute is the difference between winning and losing, between profit and failure. 9 o'clock means 9 o'clock, not 9:01, not 9:02. You are in your seats, working, at 9 sharp, or you're gone. John felt his stomach tighten. Around the table, heads bowed in silence. Everyone had heard this before, but today Harrison's tone had an edge, like a blade pressed to the skin. "And don't think you can make up for it with overtime," Harrison continued, pacing like a prosecutor. "This isn't a free-for-all, this is discipline. From now on, I want exact compliance, 9 to 5, no exceptions." There was a pause, heavy as lead. Then Emily raised her hand, calm, cool, almost smiling. "So, just to be clear," she said, "if a client calls at 5:01, we should just let it ring?" A nervous chuckle rippled through the room, quickly strangled by Harrison's glare. "You follow the rules," he snapped. "If it says 9 to 5, you work 9 to 5. You're not smarter than the system. This is not negotiable." His words fell like iron bars. The meeting ended as abruptly as it began. Harrison stalked back to his glass fortress. Employees shuffled out, whispering their complaints, but never daring to raise their voices. Emily drifted to John's desk, leaning casually against the divider. "Well," she said, a wry smile tugging at her lips, "he wants 9 to 5, he'll get 9 to 5. John looked up from his blank screen. "You're joking." "Not at all," Emily replied. "If he wants the rules followed to the letter, then we follow them to the letter. No unpaid overtime, no bending, no covering his mistakes, pure, perfect obedience." John let out a dry laugh. "That's malicious compliance." She raised an eyebrow. "I call it poetic justice." The idea lodged in John's brain like a spark in dry wood. He thought about the nights he'd stayed past 9, sacrificing dinners, missing birthdays, grinding away for a man who never said thank you. He thought about the weekends Harrison had called just to check in, the endless emails, the unpaid hours that had bled him dry, and for what? A half-hearted bonus? A pat on the back? That night, at exactly 5 p.m., John shut down his computer. The monitor went black, and for the first time in years, so did his guilt. He didn't linger. He didn't check emails. He walked out of the building, alongside Emily, into the glow of the setting sun. Behind them, in the glass-walled corner office, Richard Harrison stood watching, his jaw tightening as the floor emptied on the dot. John didn't look back. If Harrison wanted a war of rules, then war was what he would get. The next morning, John Miller arrived at 8:57 a.m. He swiped his badge, rode the elevator in silence, and sat at his desk exactly 3 minutes before the clock struck 9. His heart was steady, but he felt something new, a quiet defiance pulsing beneath his skin. The floor was unusually calm. Normally, employees logged in early, already buried in emails, trying to impress Harrison with extra effort. Not today. At 9 a.m. sharp, keyboards began to clatter. Not a second earlier, John caught Emily's eye across the floor. She smirked, then tapped her watch. The rebellion had begun. Harrison's suspicion. By mid-morning, Harrison was circling the floor like a hawk. His polished shoes clicked against the tiles, his gaze snapping to every monitor, every employee. He stopped at one cubicle, leaned over, and growled, "You started this report late." The analyst, a young man named Carter, looked up nervously. "Sir, I logged in right at 9. Company policy, right?" Harrison's eyes narrowed. He straightened slowly, his jaw flexing. "Correct," he muttered, and moved on. John almost smiled. The first crack in the armor. Coffee breaks. At 10:30 a.m., a cluster of employees stood up simultaneously. Harrison's head shot up from his office. "Where are you going?" he barked. "Break time," Emily answered, calm as glass. 15 minutes, as outlined in the handbook. "Now? In the middle of tasks?" She shrugged. "Rules are rules." The group vanished toward the break room, leaving Harrison standing alone, his face darkening by the second. Lunch hour. At noon, it happened again. At the stroke of 12, half the floor stood and left. No emails answered, no phones picked up, just silence. John walked out with Emily, carrying his lunch. As they stepped into the sunlit street, Emily chuckled. "You feel that?" she asked. "What?" "Freedom." John exhaled slowly. He hadn't felt this light in years. The meeting that fell apart that afternoon, Harrison scheduled a mandatory strategy meeting. Normally, employees would arrive early, laptops open, notes prepared. Not today. At 3 p.m., sharp, everyone filed in, not a second earlier. And at 4 p.m. sharp, as Harrison ranted about quarterly goals, chairs scraped back, employees stood and began to leave. "Where the hell are you going?" Harrison thundered. "Meeting time is over, sir," John said, keeping his voice even. 1 hour, as per policy." The room froze. Harrison's eyes locked on John, fury simmering. But John didn't flinch. For the first time, he felt the power shift. The client call the next day brought the real test. A high-value client was scheduled for a video call at 4:45 p.m. The presentation was crucial. Millions of dollars hung in the balance. The team delivered their slides, answered questions, and wrapped up at 5 p.m. on the dot. Then the client asked, "Could we go over one more detail? It'll only take a few minutes." Harrison opened his mouth to insist, but John's voice cut clean through the silence. "Unfortunately, our office hours end at 5. We'll be happy to continue tomorrow." And just like that, the call ended. The screen went black. The room was silent. Harrison's face was a storm. "You just jeopardized a contract," he hissed. John met his gaze evenly. "No, sir, we followed your rules." The meltdown. That night, Harrison stalked his glass office long after the floor had emptied. Through the transparent walls, John watched him pace, his face red, his hands clenched. The man looked less like a leader and more like a caged animal. Emily leaned against John's desk, her smile sharp. "He's cracking," she whispered. "And it's only been 2 days." John didn't answer. He was watching the cracks widen, waiting for the collapse. Because one thing was clear. This wasn't just about hours anymore. This was about power. And power, John thought, was about to change hands. Part 3. The Pressure Cooker. The third day of strict compliance began like the last two, the hum of computers igniting at 9 a.m. Sharp. Coffee cups clinking only after the official break bell, the entire office moving like synchronized dancers in a performance choreographed by fear. But this time, there was a difference. By mid-morning, John Miller noticed beads of sweat on Richard Harrison's forehead. The boss's jaw ticked, his voice cut sharper, his eyes darted to the clock more than to the reports in front of him. Something was unraveling, and John could feel the tension tightening across the office like piano wire stretched too far. Harrison strikes back. At 10:45 a.m., Harrison stormed into the bullpen, waving a stack of client emails. This, he slammed the papers on an empty desk, is what happens when people treat work like a stopwatch. We missed 2 client follow-ups yesterday. Do you think clients care about your coffee breaks? Do you think the market closes at 5? No one answered. The silence was heavy, oppressive. Harrison's eyes landed on John. Miller, you were on that call yesterday. Why didn't you stay late to finish it? John sat straighter, calm. Because you said 9 to 5, no exceptions. A vein pulsed at Harrison's temple. Don't twist my words. You know damn well what I meant. Emily's voice sliced through the tension. Actually, sir, we're doing exactly what you asked. A few stifled coughs covered nervous laughter. Harrison's glare could have burned steel. Mandatory overtime. That afternoon, Harrison called an emergency meeting. The conference room buzzed with unease as employees filed in. Enough, Harrison barked. This experiment in clock watching is over. Effective immediately, I'm instituting mandatory overtime. Everyone stays until the work is done. I don't care what time that is. A collective gasp filled the room. Emily's eyes widened, but John noticed her lips curl into the faintest smile because she knew exactly what was coming. From the back of the room, a calm, measured voice spoke. It was Patricia Wong, head of HR. She adjusted her glasses and said firmly, Richard, you can't do that. Every head turned. Patricia was respected, feared even someone who didn't speak unless the law was on her side. Company policy, she continued, flipping through a folder, states that work hours are 9 to 5. Mandatory overtime requires board approval. If you enforce it unilaterally, you'll put the company at risk of a lawsuit. The room froze. Harrison's face turned crimson. He looked like a man who had swallowed poison. Rule against rule. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Harrison's empire of rules, the same iron bars he'd forced around his team, were now the same bars locking him in place. He had built a cage and discovered he was trapped inside it. John leaned back, fighting to keep his expression neutral. Inside, his heart pounded with something that felt dangerously close to satisfaction. Emily leaned over and whispered just loud enough for John to hear, "The house always wins. Except when the house plays by its own rules." The office cracks. By the 4th day, the office no longer felt like a workplace. It felt like a pressure cooker. Every keystroke was mechanical, every break synchronized, every meeting ended mid-sentence when the clock struck. Harrison stalked the floor, barking orders no one disobeyed but no one bent, either. His authority was becoming a hollow echo, bouncing back against the walls of his own policies. He called for volunteers to stay late, but nobody raised a hand. He asked for initiative, but every task was executed with robotic precision, nothing more, nothing less. Clients grew restless, reports stacked up, deadlines slipped through the cracks like sand through fingers. The harder Harrison gripped, the more control he lost. The boiling point Friday afternoon, the true explosion came. A major client, furious about delays, demanded an urgent revision of a proposal. The request landed on John's desk at 4:45 p.m., 15 minutes before closing. Harrison appeared behind him like a shadow, voice low and venomous. "Finish it tonight." John turned slowly, meeting his eyes. "It's a 3-hour job. It'll be ready Monday morning." "Do it tonight," Harrison repeated, his fists clenched. John stood, his voice calm but loud enough for the floor to hear. "Sir, it's 4:45. The rules are clear. I leave at 5. The office went silent. Every head turned. The ticking clock on the wall was deafening. At 5 o'clock sharp, John shut his laptop. Emily rose too, folding her arms. One by one, the entire floor stood and began shutting down their computers, the synchronized motion like soldiers obeying an unspoken command. Harrison's face twisted, his voice rising in a roar. "This is insubordination!" But no one stopped. The floor emptied, the lights dimmed, and Harrison was left standing alone in a sea of silence. Outside the storm, in the elevator, John felt his heart racing. Emily leaned against the wall, her smile calm, but her eyes glittered with fire. "He's breaking," she whispered. "Next week, he'll either explode or implode." John nodded slowly, staring at his reflection in the mirrored doors. He had never felt so exhausted, so tense, and yet so alive. Because he knew something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't just compliance anymore. This was resistance. and resistance was growing stronger by the day. Monday mornings were always bad, but this one felt different. The office was silent in that particular way. Storms are silent before they hit unnatural, electric, brittle. John Miller walked in at 8:57 a.m., coffee in hand, and felt it in the air. People were whispering, eyes flicking nervously toward the glass-walled office at the end of the floor. Richard Harrison was already there. He wasn't sitting, he was pacing, back and forth, a caged animal in a suit. His face was pale, his fists tight. The weekend had done nothing to cool his rage. If anything, it had sharpened it. At 9 o'clock sharp, the keyboards came alive, just as they always did. The dance of malicious compliance continued, perfect, precise, suffocating. Harrison's jaw flexed. He yanked his door open. "Conference room," he barked. "All of you, now." The confrontation. The room filled quickly, chairs scraping against the floor, employees hunched in anxious silence. John sat midway down the table, Emily to his left. Harrison stood at the head like a prosecutor, about to deliver a death sentence. "I've had enough," he began, his voice trembling with fury. This charade ends today. You think you're clever? You think you can hide behind rules, behind schedules, and make a fool out of me? You're destroying this company." No one moved. The air was thick, pressing down like a weight. Harrison slammed his hand on the table. "Answer me. Who started this? Who's responsible?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then John lifted his eyes and spoke, calm and steady. "We're all responsible. We're doing what you told us. Nothing more, nothing less." A ripple ran through the room. Emily's lips twitched in the ghost of a smile. Harrison froze, staring at John like he'd just been stabbed. "You!" Harrison's voice cracked. "You're leading this rebellion." John shook his head. "It's not a rebellion, it's compliance. Exactly what you asked for." Harrison explodes. The boss's composure shattered. He leaned forward, veins bulging in his neck. "You smug little, do you think this is a game? We're bleeding clients. Deadlines are slipping. And all because you want to play lawyer with my words?" John didn't flinch. "Because we want to survive your rules. You set them, we follow them. If they don't work, that's not on us." The room was silent except for the sound of Harrison's breathing, heavy and ragged. His fist slammed the table again. "You're finished, Miller. You and anyone who thinks like you, you're done here." Gasps rippled around the room. Emily leaned forward, her voice cold. "Are you firing him for doing exactly what you ordered?" That's when the door opened. The board steps and Patricia Wong from HR entered, flanked by two members of senior management. Their expressions were unreadable, but their timing was surgical. "Richard," Patricia said sharply. "That's enough," Harrison whirled. "Stay out of this. I'm running my team." "No," Patricia replied, her voice like ice. "You're destroying it. We've received complaints. Formal complaints. About hostile management, unrealistic demands, and now threats of termination without cause." The room went still. Employees sat frozen, barely breathing. One of the senior managers, Mr. Kent, folded his arms. "Richard, your own policies are strangling productivity. This floor is paralyzed because of you. We've had enough." Harrison sputtered, his face blotched red. They twisted my words." "No," Patricia cut in. "They followed them. To the letter." The shift. The silence that followed was deafening. Harrison stood at the head of the table, shaking, his authority bleeding out like air from a punctured tire. For years, his power had been absolute. Now, it was crumbling, piece by piece, in front of his subordinates. John sat quietly, watching the collapse. For once, he didn't feel small. For once, he felt steady, rooted, immovable. Emily's hand brushed his under the table, a quick squeeze of solidarity. Harrison finally sank into his chair, defeated, his shoulders sagging. He looked less like a leader and more like a man who'd lost everything. The end of fear. Patricia turned to the employees. "Effective immediately, Mr. Harrison is suspended pending review. In the meantime, your team will report directly to senior management. You'll continue your hours as normal without harassment." Gasps turned into murmurs, murmurs into cautious smiles. The spell of fear that had held the office in its grip for years cracked, then shattered. As people filed out, whispering and exchanging glances, Emily leaned toward John. Her voice was low, almost reverent. "You just killed a king." John shook his head. "Number, he killed himself. We just watched." The breaking point. That evening, at 5 p.m., sharp, John shut down his laptop. This time, There was no tension, no fear, no secret thrill, just peace. Around him, colleagues did the same, moving with a freedom he hadn't seen in years. As he walked out into the evening light, Emily by his side, John realized the truth. Malicious compliance hadn't just broken Harrison, it had freed them all. Part 5. The Fall of the Boss. The following week felt like waking up in a house after a storm. The walls were still standing, but everything inside was rearranged, unsettled. The 14th floor of Harrison & Cole Financial no longer operated under the weight of Richard Harrison's shadow. His glass-walled office stood empty, blinds half drawn, desk untouched. For years it had been a command post, now it looked like a museum exhibit of arrogance. John Miller walked past it each morning with a strange sense of disbelief. For nearly a decade, Harrison's presence had dictated every movement, when people stood, when they spoke, when they left. Now that gravitational pull was gone, and the office spun awkwardly in the sudden vacuum. Silence after the storm. At first, no one knew how to act. Monday morning, employees still sat down at exactly 9 a.m., fingers poised like nervous pianists waiting for the conductor's cue. But there was no conductor. The silence was uncanny. By Tuesday, habits began to loosen. Breaks stretched longer. Conversations grew bolder. Laughter trickled back into the air. Someone even played music softly from a desk speaker, something Harrison would have killed on the spot. Emily Torres leaned against John's cubicle, sipping coffee, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "You notice it?" she asked. John looked up from his monitor. "Notice what?" "The sound of people breathing again." She gestured around. "For years, we were holding our breath. Now, it's like we're learning how to inhale." John smiled faintly. She was right. For the first time, the office didn't feel like a prison, it felt like a workplace. Imperfect, messy, but human. The investigation. Of course, the story didn't end with Harrison's suspension. Corporate investigations moved slowly, but steadily. HR and senior management interviewed employees, collected emails, reviewed policies. One afternoon, Patricia Wong stopped by John's desk. Her presence drew glances. She was a woman whose authority carried weight in every corner of the building. "John," she said quietly, "we may need you to give a statement." John nodded. "About what happened last week?" "About the culture," Patricia clarified. "About the pattern of behavior. Harrison's words, his enforcement. The board wants the full picture," John agreed, though unease settled in his chest. He wasn't used to being the center of anything. For years his strategy had been invisibility, do the work, avoid the spotlight. Now he was being asked to shine a light into the darkest parts of the office. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, hearing Harrison's voice echo in his head. "You're finished, Miller." Testimony. The interview happened on Wednesday in a quiet conference room. John sat across from Patricia and two board members, a recorder on the table between them. "Mr. Miller," Patricia began, "we understand you were present during several key incidents. We'd like you to describe them in your own words." John swallowed, then spoke. He described the infamous 9 a.m. rule, the break time policing, the client call cut short at 5 o'clock sharp. He told them about Harrison's rants, his threats, his obsession with control. The board members took notes, occasionally exchanging glances. One of them, a man named Kent, finally asked, "And how did the team respond?" John paused. "We obeyed, perfectly. That was the only way to survive. But in obeying, we exposed the flaws. His system collapsed because it couldn't bend." There was silence, broken only by the scratch of pens. Patricia nodded slowly. "Thank you, John. That will be all." The verdict. By Friday, the decision was made. A company-wide email landed in inboxes at 9:15 a.m. Subject: Leadership. Transition. Effective immediately, Richard Harrison has resigned from his position as Director of Operations. Senior management will assume direct oversight of the 14th floor until a replacement is appointed. We thank Mr. Harrison for his years of service. No one believed the word resigned. Everyone knew what it meant. Harrison had been forced out. The tyrant was gone. The office buzzed with relief, cautious at first, then celebratory. Some people even clapped. Others shared stories, things they'd never dared admit out loud about late-night emails, slammed doors, impossible demands. Emily leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, watching it unfold. "And just like that," she said, "the king is dead." John didn't smile. He felt the weight of it differently. Yes, Harrison was gone, but the scars of his rule remained. Years of fear, of bending under pressure, didn't vanish overnight. Reflection. That evening, John left the office at 5 o'clock sharp, as he had every day that week. The sky outside was washed in gold, the city buzzing with Friday night energy. He walked slowly, thinking. Emily caught up to him on the street. "You should be happy," she said. "We won." John glanced at her. "Did we? Or did we just survive?" She tilted her head, considering. Maybe survival is its own kind of victory. They walked in silence for a while. John thought about Harrison, about his face twisted in rage, about the way power had curdled into paranoia. He thought about how quickly control could rot, how fragile authority really was. And he thought about compliance, how something as simple as following the rules too perfectly could topple a tyrant. The fall. The following Monday, the glass office at the end of the floor was stripped bare. Harrison's nameplate was gone. The blinds were open, sunlight pouring in. For the first time in years, the view wasn't blocked by shadows. John stood there for a moment, staring into the empty space. It didn't look like power anymore. It looked like absence. Emily joined him, her voice soft. "Looks better this way, doesn't it?" John nodded. Empty suits always look smaller when you take the man out of them. They turned back toward the floor, where work continued messy, imperfect, but alive. Harrison had fallen, but life went on. For John, that was the real victory. Not revenge, not rebellion, but the return of something he hadn't felt in years. Breathing space, and maybe, just maybe, freedom. Part 6. The Lesson of Compliance. The weeks after Richard Harrison's fall blurred into something John Miller could hardly recognize as the same workplace he had walked into for years. The 14th floor breathed again. The air, once heavy with suspicion, carried laughter. People took breaks without glancing nervously at the clock. Conversations blossomed. Even mistakes inevitable, human mistakes were treated with solutions, not punishment. And yet, amid the relief, John felt something quieter. A gravity. A need to make sense of what had happened. The ghost of the office. Every time John passed the empty glass office, he thought about power. He thought about how a man could build walls of rules so rigid that he trapped himself inside them. Harrison's downfall wasn't just arrogance, it was fragility. Emily noticed his silence one afternoon. She leaned on the divider of his cubicle, her coffee steaming in hand. "You're brooding again," she teased. John smiled faintly. "Just thinking." "About what?" He looked at the empty office at the end of the floor. How quickly fear disappears when the source is gone. For years we let him control every breath, and now it feels like he was never here. Emily tilted her head. "Maybe that's the point. Fear only feels permanent when you're inside it. Step out and it dissolves." The new normal. By the second month, leadership shifted. A new director arrived, not a tyrant, not a saint, just a manager who treated people like people. Work improved. Clients noticed the change. The company steadied itself. But John wasn't the same. He found himself leaving at 5 with no guilt, eating dinner with friends, sleeping through the night. For the first time in years, he remembered what it felt like to live outside the office walls. One evening, Emily caught him on the elevator ride down. "Strange, isn't it?" she said. "What is?" "How normal feels radical after chaos." John chuckled. "Maybe normal is the real rebellion." The lesson 1. Friday evening, John lingered a little later than usual, not to work, but to think. He stood by the window, the city glowing beneath the sunset. He thought about rules, obedience, and the strange power of compliance. It struck him that rebellion hadn't required shouting or breaking laws. It had required something subtler, almost ironic, following orders too well. Harrison had demanded perfection. They had given him exactly that, and perfection destroyed him. John whispered to himself, almost as if testing the thought aloud. Sometimes, the sharpest weapon isn't defiance, it's obedience sharpened into a mirror. Behind him, Emily's voice broke the silence. "Talking to yourself again?" He smiled. "Just finishing the story." Epilogue. At 5 p.m. sharp, John shut down his computer. Around him, others did the same, not out of fear, not out of ritual, but because the day was over. Work could wait. Life could not. As he stepped into the elevator, Emily at his side, John felt lighter. The war of rules was finished. The tyrant had fallen. And what remained was a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. That power untempered by humanity collapses. That fear is fragile. That compliance, when wielded with patience, can be as revolutionary as rebellion. The doors closed, the city awaited. And for the first time in years, John Miller didn't feel like a prisoner of the clock. He felt free,